Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Catherine Lopez-Luker. Let's go with Heidi as she accompanies Goat Peter to the high mountain pastures with the herds of jumping, bleating, engaging animals. Heidi soon learns each goat's name and its little characteristics. She has never been so happy in her life, and when the sun begins to go down and colors the mountains in a rosy glow, Heidi feels that she is in the most beautiful spot in the world. All summer long she enjoys the mountains, and when winter comes, not only is the snow a different kind of beauty, but Heidi goes on a fast sled ride down to visit Goat Peter's grandmother and finds in her another person to love. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Heidi, Chapter 3. In the pasture. Heidi was awakened bright and early by a loud whistle, and when she opened her eyes, a golden light came pouring in through the round hole, upon her bed and upon the hay beside it, so that everything around her was gleaming like gold. At first she looked about her in surprise, and she had no idea where she was. But then she heard the deep voice of her grandfather outside the hut, and she remembered everything, where she had come from, and that she was now up on the mountain meadow with her grandfather, and no longer at old Ursula's. Ursula was almost deaf, and generally half frozen, so that she was always sitting by the kitchen fire, or by the stove in the living room. And so it was that Heidi had to stay there too, so the old lady could tell where she was, because she was too deaf to hear her. Heidi had felt very shut in many times, and would sooner have played out of doors. Therefore she was very glad to wake up in her new home, and to think of all the new things she had seen yesterday, and all there were to see again today. Above all, Schweinli and Bearli. Heidi sprang hastily from her bed, and in a few minutes had put on everything she had worn the day before, which was little enough. Then she climbed down the ladder and ran out in front of the cottage. There, sure enough, stood Goat Peter with his flock, and grandfather was at that moment fetching little Swan and little Bear out of the shed to join the company. Heidi ran to meet him, to tell him and the goats good day. "Do you want to go along to the pasture?" grandfather asked. That just suited Heidi, and she hopped around for joy. "First go and wash yourself clean, or the sun will laugh at you when it is shining so finely up there above everything, and sees that you are dirty. Look, everything is ready for you over yonder." Grandfather pointed to a big tub full of water, which stood by the doorway in the sunshine. Heidi ran to it and splashed and rubbed until her face shone. Meanwhile, grandfather went inside the cottage and called to Peter, "Come here, Goat General, and bring your knapsack with you." Peter was surprised, but he obeyed and stretched out the small sack in which he carried his poor dinner. "Open it," the man ordered, and he put in a big slice of bread and an equally large piece of cheese. Peter opened his round eyes as wide as they would go, for both pieces were half as large again as the two that he had brought for his own noonday meal. "There, and now the little bowl goes in too," continued Nuncle. "For the child cannot drink as you do right from the goat. She doesn't know how. Milk 2 bowlsful for her at noon. The child is going with you and is going to stay until you come down again. See that she doesn't fall over the cliff. Do you hear me?" Then Heidi came running up. "Can the sun laugh at me now, grandfather?" she asked earnestly. In her fear about the sun, she had rubbed her face, neck, and arms so astonishingly with the coarse cloth her grandfather had hung up beside the water tub, that she stood before the old man as red as a lobster. He laughed a little. No, the sun has nothing to grin at now," he said. "But let me tell you one thing. Tonight when you come home, all of you is going into the tub, just like a little fish. For when you go out as the goats do, you get your feet dirty. And now you can set out." Off they went happily up the mountain meadow. During the night, the wind had blown away the last bit of cloud. From every side the sky looked down on them, deep blue, and in the midst of it stood the shining sun, lighting up the green pasture. And all the blue and yellow flowers on the meadow opened their eyes and looked at them joyfully. Heidi ran hither and thither and cried aloud for happiness, for here were whole companies of dainty red primroses, and over there it was all blue with pretty gentians, and everywhere soft-leafed yellow rock roses were laughing and nodding in the sunshine. Heidi, because of her delight at all the gleaming, beckoning flowers, quite forgot the goats, and Peter into the bargain. She made long trips ahead and off to one side, for here the flowers sparkled red, and they're yellow, luring her in every direction. And everywhere Heidi picked great heaps of flowers. She stuffed them in her apron, for she wanted to take them all home with her and put them in the hay in her bedroom, so that it might seem like out of doors. So today Peter was forced to look in all directions, and his round eyes, which did not move very quickly from one thing to another, had more to do than they could well attend to, for the goats acted as badly as Heidi. They flashed here and there, and he was kept busy, whistling and calling and swinging his whip to drive all the runaways together again. "And where have you got to this time?" he was now crying in almost an angry tone of voice. "Here," came the answer from somewhere behind him. Peter could see nobody, for Heidi was sitting on the ground, behind a knoll that was thickly sown with sweet-smelling prunellas. The whole air around was so filled with their fragrance that Heidi had never smelled anything so lovely. She sat down among the flowers and took deep breaths of the perfume. "Come on," Peter called again. "You mustn't fall over the cliffs. Nuncle forbade you to." "Where are the cliffs?" Heidi called back to ask. But she did not budge from the spot, for the sweet perfume was borne on each new breeze more delightfully than ever to the child. "Up there, up away. We have a long way before us still, so come right along. And at the very top, the old bird of prey sits and croaks." That sounded interesting. Heidi jumped up at once and flew to Peter, her apron filled with flowers. "You have enough now," he said, as together they began climbing again. "If you don't stop, you'll never get away from here, and if you pick them all now, there won't be any left for tomorrow." This last reason seemed good to Heidi, and besides, she had already filled her apron so full that there was no room for any more, and there must be some left to pick tomorrow. So she tramped along with Peter, and the goats became more quiet too, for they smelled from afar the good herbs of the high pasture ground, and so hurried on without delay. The pasture where Peter usually halted his goats and set up his quarters for the day lay at the foot of tall cliffs. These rocks lower down were covered with bushes and fir trees, but higher up they rose toward the sky quite bald and steep. There were great chasms in the cliffs on one side of the mountain, and the grandfather had been quite right in warning the children about them. When Peter had reached this point of the heights, he took off his sack and laid it carefully in a small hollow in the ground, for he knew the wind often swept in strong gusts at this spot, and Peter knew it and did not wish to see his precious possessions rolling down the mountainside. Then Peter stretched himself out on the ground of the sunny pasture, for he had to rest after the hard work of his climb. In the meantime, Heidi had laid aside her apron, and had rolled it up neatly with the flowers inside it, and had placed it beside the lunch bag in the hollow, and now she was sitting close to the outstretched Peter, and gazing around her. The valley lay far beneath them in the full morning sunshine. Before her, Heidi saw a large white field of snow, which rose high up into the dark blue sky. To the left of this stood an enormous mass of cliffs, and on each side of it a high rock tower stretched bare and jagged up into the blue and seemed to stare very solemnly down upon Heidi. The child sat as still as a mouse and looked about her. Everywhere there was a great deep stillness, except that the wind moved quite softly and gently across the dainty bluebells and the bright yellow rock roses, which bloomed about her on every side and nodded happily to and fro on their slender stems. Peter had fallen asleep after his hard work, and the goats were climbing up above among the bushes. In her whole life, Heidi had never been so happy as now. She drank in the golden sunlight, the sweet smell of the flowers, the fresh air, and wanted nothing so much as to stay there for always. A good while passed in this way. Heidi had stared so often and so long at the tall mountain blocks that it seemed as if they, too, all had human faces and were looking down at her like old friends. All at once, Heidi heard above her a loud, sharp screaming and croaking, and as she looked up, there circled over her the biggest bird she had ever seen in all her life. It wheeled through the air with far outstretched wings, and kept coming back again in great circles of flight, to scream loud and shrill above Heidi's head. "Peter! Peter, wake up!" Heidi cried aloud. "Look! There's the bird of prey! Look! Look!" Peter rose at her call, and together they stared after the bird, which kept flying higher and higher up into the blue sky until it finally vanished above the gray cliffs. "Where has he gone now?" asked Heidi, who had been following the bird with eager eyes. "Home to his nest," was Peter's answer. "Has he a home way up over there? Oh, how fine to be so high up! Why does he screech so?" Heidi went on to ask. "That's just the way he's made," Peter explained. "Let's just climb up and see where his nest is," Heidi said. "Ho, ho, ho!" Peter broke out, "when the goats themselves can't get up there. And Uncle said you mustn't fall over the cliffs." And suddenly Peter began to whistle and call so sharply that Heidi did not know what was going on. But the goats seemed to understand his noise, for one after the other they kept leaping down until the whole herd was gathered on the green slope. Some kept nibbling at the spicy stalks, some ran this way and that, others were butting one another playfully with their horns. Heidi had jumped up and was darting around among the goats, for it was a lot of fun for her to see the little animals huddling together and making merry. She ran from one to another and struck up a real friendship with each, for every goat seemed somehow different and had his own peculiar ways. While she was doing this, Peter fetched the lunch bag and placed the pieces of bread and cheese on the ground in a neat square, the large ones on Heidi's side and the small ones on his own, for he knew exactly whose were whose. After that he took the little bowl, milked fine fresh milk from Schweinli into it, and placed the bowl in the center of the square. Then he called Heidi to him, but he had to call longer than he did to get the goats, because the child was so happily excited at the amusing play of her new comrades that she had eyes and ears for nothing else. But Peter knew how to make himself heard. He yelled until the sound echoed up in the cliffs. Then Heidi appeared, and the table he had spread looked so inviting that she hopped about for joy. "Stop your dancing, it's time to eat," Peter said. "Sit down and get started." Heidi took her seat. "Is the milk mine?" she asked, again casting a satisfied look at the neat square and the chief object in the middle of it. "Yes," Peter replied, "and the large things to eat are yours too. And when you've drunk it up, you get another bowlful from Schweinli, and then it's my turn." "And where do you get your milk from?" Heidi wanted to know. "From my goat, from Dapple. You go ahead and eat," Peter again advised her. Heidi started with her milk, and as soon as she set down her empty bowl, Peter got up and fetched a second one. At that, Heidi broke off a piece of her bread, and the remaining portion, which was larger than Peter's own share had been, she handed him, together with its big slice of cheese. "You can have it," she said. "I've had enough." Peter gazed at Heidi so astonished that he could not say a word, for never in his life had he been able to make such an offer and to give something away. He held back a little at first, for he could not quite believe that Heidi was in earnest. But she kept holding the pieces out to him, and when Peter failed to take them, she laid them on the boy's knees. Then he saw that she was not joking. He seized the gift, nodded his head in thanks and willingness to accept the present, and had the most abundant lunch he had enjoyed since he had been a goatherd. While he was eating, Heidi looked at the goats. "What are all their names, Peter?" she asked. He knew that right enough, and could keep their names in his head all the more easily, because he did not have much else to store up in it. So he began without hesitation to name one after the other, pointing out each goat as he went along. Heidi listened eagerly to his teaching, and it was not long before she could tell them apart and call each one by its name, for they all had special marks by which one could keep them in mind, if one but paid close attention, the way Heidi did. That was Big Turk with the thick horns. He always wanted to butt all the others, and they mostly ran away when he came, for they wanted nothing to do with the rough fellow. Only Bold Goldfinch, also known as Distelfink, a lean and lively goat, was not afraid of him, and often tore after him 3 or 4 times in succession, so quickly and sturdily that Big Turk would halt astonished and try no further attack, for Goldfinch seemed eager for a fight and had sharp little horns. Then came little white Snowhopper, who was always bleating so sadly and pitifully that Heidi several times had run to her and taken her head in her arms to comfort her. And now the child ran to her again, for the pitiful young voice had once again cried out in appeal. Heidi placed her arms around the neck of the young kid and asked with much sympathy, "What's the matter, Schneehöppli? Why do you cry so for help?" The kid snuggled closely to Heidi and then was still. Peter called over from where he was sitting, pausing a few times to chew and to swallow. "She acts that way because her old nanny goat no longer comes along. They sold her at Mayenfeld day before yesterday, so she comes no more up to the mountain meadow." "Who is the old nanny goat?" Heidi asked. "Ha! The mother, of course," was the answer. "Where's the grandmother, then?" Heidi called again. "Hasn't any." "And the grandfather?" "Hasn't one." "Oh, you poor little Snowhopper," said Heidi, and pressed the small creature tenderly against her. "But please don't whimper so any more. Just look, I'm coming with you every day, and then you won't feel so lonely any longer. And if there's anything wrong with you, you can come straight to me." Schneehöppli rubbed her head delightedly against Heidi's shoulder, and stopped her mournful bleating. Meanwhile, Peter had finished his noonday meal, and had now returned to his herd and to Heidi, who was beginning to ask about all sorts of new things. By far the 2 prettiest, cleanest goats of the whole herd were Schweinli and Bärli, who carried themselves with a certain grand manner, generally minded their own business, and treated the silly Turk in the way that he deserved. The little animals had now begun to climb again toward the bushes, and each one had his own way of doing this. Some jumped along carelessly over everything, others sniffed out the good herbs as they went more slowly, and Turk, of course, sought someone to attack. Little Swan and Little Bear clambered prettily and lightly upward, and finding at once the nicest bushes, they stopped and nibbled daintily at them. Heidi stood with her hands behind her back and looked at all the goats very closely. "Peter," she said to the lad, who was again stretched out on the ground, "Schweinli and Bärli are the prettiest of them all." "Don't I know that?" was the answer. "Meadow Nuncle scrubs and washes them. He gives them salt and has the best stable." But suddenly Peter sprang up and tore at top speed toward the goats, with Heidi right on his heels. Something must have happened, and she did not want to be left behind. Peter ran through the midst of the flock of goats to the side of the mountain meadow, where the cliffs descended steep and bare far below. and where a careless goat, if he went too near, might easily plunge down and break all of its bones. He had seen the reckless goldfinch was hopping over in that direction, and he got there just in the nick of time, for the silly little animal was leaping in that moment toward the edge of the rocks. Peter was on the point of seizing it when he stumbled and fell to the ground, and in his fall was only able to grasp one of the animal's legs and hold fast to it. Distelfink bleated aloud his anger and amazement to have his leg gripped so and to be kept from continuing his blithe stroll. He struggled to go ahead. Peter shrieked for Heidi to help him, for he could not get up and was almost tearing Goldfinch's leg off. Heidi was there in a flash and saw at once the danger of both of them. She quickly plucked from the ground some sweet-smelling herbs and held them under Distelfink's nose and said, "Come, Goldfinch, come, don't be such a goose. Why, look, you might fall down and break a leg, and that would hurt you awfully." The goat had turned around quickly and begun to eat the herbs from Heidi's hand with much content. In the meantime, Peter had got to his feet and seized the rope, by which the bell was hung on Distelfink's neck. Heidi grasped the cord by the other side, and thus the two led the runaway back to the peacefully grazing herd. When Peter had brought the goat back to a safe place, he raised his rod and was going to give him a sound thrashing as a punishment. Goldfinch drew back in fright, for he saw what was going to happen too. But Heidi screamed, "No, no, Peter, you mustn't beat him. See how scared he is." "He deserves to be," growled Peter, and started to strike. But Heidi grasped his arm and cried angrily, "You shan't do a thing to him. It will hurt him. Let him go." Peter gazed in great surprise at Heidi. Her black eyes gleamed at him so that he lowered his rod. "Well, I'll let him go then, if you'll give me some more of your cheese tomorrow," Peter said in surrender. He wanted to have some reward for his fright. "You can have all of it, every bit, tomorrow and every other day," Heidi promised him. "I don't want it, and I'll give you a lot of bread, too, just like today. But then you must never pound Distelfink, nor Schneehöppli, nor any other goat. Never." "That suits me all right," Peter remarked, and with him that was as good as a promise. So he let the rascal go, and happy Goldfinch leaped high into the air, and then flashed back to the herd. So the day had passed unnoticed, and the sun was already on the point of setting behind the mountains. Heidi sat down again and gazed very quietly at the bluebells and the rock roses. They were sparkling in the golden evening light, and all the grass seemed as if touched with gold, and the cliffs above her began to glisten and glimmer, and suddenly Heidi jumped up and cried, "Oh, Peter, Peter, it's burning! All the mountains are on fire, and the big snow over there is on fire too, and the sky, oh, just look! The great rock mountain is all golden red. Oh, the pretty flaming snow! Peter, get up! The fire is at the Bird of Prey's home. Look at the cliffs, look at the firs. Everything is burning up." "It's always been like that," Peter now said good-naturedly, as he kept on peeling his rod. "But that isn't fire." "What is it then?" cried Heidi as she ran back and forth, so she could look everywhere. It was so pretty in all directions that she just could not get enough of it. "What is it, Peter? What can it be?" she asked again. "It comes that way all by itself," Peter explained. But just see," Heidi cried, very much excited. "All of a sudden it's growing rosy red. Look at the mountain with the snow, and the other one with the high-pointed rocks. What are they called, Peter?" "Mountains don't have names," he replied. "Oh, how pretty! See the rosy red snow. Oh, and on the rocks up there are heaps and heaps of roses. Now they're getting gray. Oh my, now it's all over, Peter." And Heidi plumped down on the ground and looked as troubled as if everything really had come to an end. "It'll be like that tomorrow again," Peter declared. "Get up. We'll have to be going home now." The goats were whistled for and gathered together. The home journey was begun. "Is it that way all days? Every day when we are at the pasture?" asked Heidi eagerly, listening for his answer as she climbed down the mountain meadow at Peter's side. "Most always," he replied. "But tomorrow again, sure?" she insisted on knowing. "Tomorrow, without any doubt," said Peter. That made Heidi happy again. And yet she had seen so many new things, so many thoughts were whirling around in her mind, that she never said a word until she came to the meadow hut and saw Grandfather sitting beneath the fir trees. He had built himself a bench there, and was always waiting there in the evening for his goats, which came down in this direction. Heidi ran straight up to him, with Little Swan and Little Bear close behind her, for the goats knew their master and their shed. Peter called after Heidi, "Come again tomorrow, won't you? Good night." For he was quite set on having Heidi go with him a second time. Then Heidi flew back to him, gave Peter her hand, and promised him that she would come along the next day. Afterward, she jumped into the midst of the departing herd, put her arms a last time around Snowhopper's neck, and said, "Sleep well, Schneehopli. Don't forget I'm coming again tomorrow, and remember, you must never again bleat again so pitifully." Snowhopper gave her a friendly look, and seemed grateful, and she ran happily off after the flock. Heidi walked back under the fir trees. "Oh, Grandfather," she called out before she had reached him, "it was so beautiful! The fire, and the roses on the cliffs, and the blue and yellow flowers. Just see what I've brought you." And thereupon Heidi poured her whole store of flowers from her folded apron at her grandfather's feet. But how the poor flowers did look! Heidi could no longer recognize them. They were all like hay. Not a single one of their cups was open. "Oh, Grandfather, what's wrong with them?" Heidi cried, quite frightened. "They weren't like that at all. Why do they look that way now?" "They want to stay out of doors in the sun, and not rolled up in your apron," Grandfather said. "Then I shan't ever pick any more of them. But, Grandfather, why did the bird of prey squawk so?" Heidi asked now earnestly. "Into the water with you, while I go to the stable and get some milk. Then we'll go into the cottage together and eat supper, and I'll tell you all about it then." Heidi did as she was asked, and later, when she sat on her high chair with her little bowl of milk before her and Grandfather next to her, she returned again to her question. "Why did the bird of prey croak and scream down at us so, Grandfather?" "He's laughing at the people down below him, who crowd into their villages and tease one another. He mocks at them and screams, 'If you'd leave one another and climb the heights, each his own way as I do, then you'd be happier.'" Grandfather spoke these words almost wildly, so that Heidi remembered the screaming of the bird of prey even more clearly than before, if such a thing was possible. "Why don't the mountains have names, Grandfather?" Heidi asked then. "But they have," he answered, "and if you can describe one so I can recognize it, I'll tell you what the name is." Then Heidi described the Rocky Mountain and its 2 high towers exactly as she had seen it, and Grandfather, well pleased, said, "Just right. I know that one. It's called Falcon's Nest. Did you see another one?" Heidi went on to describe the mountain with the great field of snow, the one on which all the snow had been afire, and then grown rosy red, and finally, without warning, had got very pale and dead. "I recognize that one also," said Grandfather. "That is the Casa Plana. You liked it then on the pasture, did you?" Now Heidi told him everything about the whole day, how lovely it had all been, and especially the fire toward evening. And now Grandfather must tell her too where that had come from, because Peter had known nothing about it. "That's done by the sun, you know," explained Grandfather. "When he says good night to the world, he sends his very finest beams to the mountains, so they won't forget him before his return in the morning." That pleased Heidi. She felt she could hardly wait until another day had come, so that she could go up to the pasture and again see how the sun said good night to the mountains. But first she had to go to bed, and she slept soundly the whole night through on her couch of hay, and she dreamed of nothing but gleaming mountains with red roses on them, and in the midst of these, little Snowhopper was running about with merry leaps. Chapter 4. At the Grandmother's. The bright sun came again on the following morning, and then Peter appeared with his goats, and they all went together back up to the pasture, and so it happened day after day. Heidi got very tanned from all this life on the mountain, and so strong and healthy that nothing was ever wrong with her, and she lived happily from one day to the next, as only the little birds can live in all the trees of the green woods. When it began to be autumn, and the wind roared more loudly across the mountains, then Grandfather would say perhaps, "Stay at home today, Heidi. With one puff the wind can blow a little thing like you over the cliffs into the valley." When Peter would hear such words in the morning, he looked quite miserable, for he could see nothing but unhappiness before him. For one thing, he did not know what to do when Heidi was not with him, and then he missed his generous dinner. Besides, the goats were so stubborn on these days that he had twice his usual trouble with them, for they were so used to Heidi's company that they would not go ahead without her, but would run away in all directions. Heidi was never dull, because she always found something to do that was fun. She would have liked best to go with the goatherd and his flock off to the meadow, to the flowers and the bird of prey. There were so many things to learn about all the goats and their different ways. But then her grandfather's hammering and sawing and carpentry work were very interesting to Heidi. Sometimes it happened that he was making the pretty round goat cheeses on the day when she was at home. Then it was quite specially enjoyable to see the remarkable work her grandfather did, with both arms bare, as he stirred what was in the great kettle. More to be desired by Heidi than all else, on such days of high wind, was the surging and roaring in the 3 old fir trees behind the hut. Whatever she might be doing, or wherever she might be, she had to run to them from time to time, for nothing in the world was so lovely and wonderful as this deep roaring up there in the treetops. Heidi would stand beneath them and listen hard, and she never could get her fill of seeing and hearing what was waving and heaving and rushing with such power among the trees. The sun no longer shone as hot as in the summer, and Heidi hunted out her little shoes and stockings, and also her little dress, for now it kept growing colder, and when Heidi stood under the fir trees, the wind blew through her as if she were a thin leaf. Still, she could not bear to stay indoors, but kept running out every time she heard the sighing of the wind. Then it grew cold in earnest, and Peter would blow on his hands when he came climbing up early in the morning. But not for long, for all of a sudden, one night a deep snow fell, and the next morning the whole mountain meadow was snow-white, and there wasn't a green leaf to be seen anywhere, no matter where you looked. After this, Peter came no more with his herd, and Heidi gazed much astonished out of the small window, for now it began to snow again, and the thick flakes fell and fell until the snow was so deep that it reached up to the window, and then it grew higher yet, so they could not open the window at all, and they were completely packed away in the cottage. That seemed very jolly to Heidi, and she kept running from one window to another just to see how things were getting on, and whether the snow was going to cover the entire hut, so that one would have to light a candle in broad day. But it did not come to that after all, and next day Grandfather went out, for it had stopped snowing, and shoveled around the whole house. He piled big heaps of snow on top of one another, so that about the hut it looked like a mountain every little way. But now the windows and doors were free again, and it was a good thing they were. For that afternoon, as Heidi and her grandfather were sitting on their 3-legged chairs by the fire, Grandfather had long since made a chair for the child. Something suddenly staggered up, stamped on the wooden threshold, and finally opened the door. It was Peter the goatherd. He had not made such a great noise at the door because he was rude, but to stamp the snow from his shoes, which were all covered with it. In fact, all of Peter was covered with snow, for he had had to push his way so violently through the deep drifts that great clumps of snow had stuck to him, and because of the sharp cold, had frozen fast. But he had not given up his trip, for he wanted to go up that day to visit Heidi, whom he had not seen for a whole long week. "Good afternoon," he said when he came in. Then he placed himself as near as possible to the fire, and had not another word to say, but his whole face lighted up with joy to think he was there. Heidi looked at him quite puzzled, for now that he was so close to the fire, the snow began to thaw on him, and Peter looked quite like a gentle waterfall. "Well, General, how are you getting along?" Grandfather said then. "Now you're without an army and have to nibble at a slate pencil." "Why does he have to bite at a slate pencil, Grandfather?" Heidi asked at once curiously. "In winter he has to go to school," the grandfather explained. "There you learn to read and write, and that's often so hard that it helps a little if you chew the end of your slate pencil. Am I right, General?" "Indeed you are," said Peter. Heidi's interest in the matter was now awakened, and she had a great many questions to ask of Peter about the school and everything that happened there, about what he saw and heard. And as much time was always spent in any talk that Peter took part in, he had a good chance to get quite dry from top to toe. It was always hard for him to put his ideas into words that would express what he meant, and this time it was harder even than usual, for scarcely had he answered one thing than Heidi would ask him 2 or 3 more questions, which required a whole sentence to answer. During all this talk the grandfather had kept very quiet indeed, but the corners of his mouth had twitched several times humorously, which was a sign that he was listening. "Well, General, now you've been under fire and need something to strengthen you. Come, join in with us." Thereupon the grandfather rose from his chair and fetched the supper from the cupboard, while Heidi drew the chairs up to the table. There was another seat which grandfather had made and nailed fast to the wall. Now that he was no longer alone, he had prepared in one place and another all sorts of seats for 2, because Heidi had a way of keeping close to him everywhere, no matter what he was doing. So all 3 of them had places to sit, and Peter opened his round eyes very wide when he saw what a mighty piece of fine dried meat Meadow Nuncle had laid on his thick slice of bread. Peter had not seen anything so good for a long time. When the merry meal was over, it began to get dark, and Peter started on his homeward way. When he had said good night and "God reward you," and was already at the door, he turned around and said, "I'm coming again Sunday a week from today, and you must come over to grandmother's sometime. She told me to say so." That was quite a new thought for Heidi, that she should go to somebody's house. But the idea became fixed in her mind, and on the very next day, her first words were, "Grandfather, now I must really go down to see grandmother. She expects me." "There's too much snow," grandfather replied, shaking his head. But the idea was fast in Heidi's mind, for you see, grandmother had sent word to her, and that settled it. So not a day passed but that the child said 5 or 6 times, "Grandfather, I've really got to go now. Grandmother is waiting for me." On the 4th day it was so cold that out of doors every footstep crunched and creaked, and the great crust of snow all around about was frozen stiff. But the bright sun was peeking in at the window, right at the high chair in which Heidi was sitting at the dinner table. So she began again her little speech. "Today I've just really got to go to grandmother's, or I'll be putting it off too long." Then grandfather got up from the dinner table, climbed up to the hayloft, brought down the thick sack that was the coverlet of Heidi's bed, and said, "Come on, then." The child skipped joyfully after him into the shining world of snow. It was now very still in the old fir trees. The white snow lay on all the boughs, and the trees glistened and sparkled everywhere in the sunshine with such glory that Heidi jumped about for joy and called out one time after another, "Come outside, Grandfather! Come on, there's pure silver and gold in the fir trees." Grandfather had gone into the workshop and now came out with a broad hand sled. It had a rod fastened to the side, and from its flat seat you could thrust your feet out in front against the snowy ground, and with one or the other of them steer in the direction you wanted to go. First, Grandfather had to examine the fir trees with Heidi, and then he sat down on the sled, took the child in his lap, bundled her up in the sack so that she would be warm as toast, and pressed her tightly to him with his left arm, as this was very necessary for the trip they were to take. Then, with his right hand, he seized the rod firmly and gave a push with both feet. At that, the sled shot away down the mountain meadow with such speed that Heidi thought it was flying through the air like a bird, and she cried out aloud. Before you knew it, the sled came to a stop right before the hut of Goat Peter. Grandfather set the child on the ground, unwrapped her coverings, and said, "There you are. Now go in, and when it begins to grow dark, come away and start on your way home." Then he turned his sled around and drew it after him up the mountain. Heidi opened the door and came into a small room, which looked quite black. There was an open hearth in it, and some plates on a stand. This was the little kitchen. Then right near, there was another door which Heidi opened too, and which led into a tiny living room. For this was not an alpine hut like Grandfather's, in which there was a single large room with a hayloft above. It was rather a very old cottage, in which everything was small, poor, and shabby. When Heidi entered the small living room, she stood right before a table at which a woman was sitting mending Peter's jacket. Heidi recognized it at once. In the corner, an old bent grandmother was sitting and spinning. Heidi had no trouble in telling who this was. She went straight to the spinning wheel and said, "Good day, Grandmother. I've come to see you at last. Did you think I was never coming?" The old lady raised her head and reached for the hand that was stretched out to her. When she had taken this, she first stroked it thoughtfully a little while with her own, and then she asked, "Are you the child who lives with Meadow Nuncle? Is your name Heidi?" "Yes, indeed," the child assured her. "I've just come down the mountain on a sled with my grandfather." "You don't say so. But how warm your hand is. Tell me, Brigida, did the Meadow Nuncle himself come down with a little girl?" Peter's mother, Brigida, who had been sewing at the table, rose and looked at the girl curiously from head to foot. Then she said, "I don't know, Mother, whether the Nuncle came down with her or not. It isn't very probable. Perhaps the child is mistaken." But Heidi looked at the woman quite decidedly, and not at all as if she did not know. "I know well enough," she said, "who wrapped me up in the bed covering and slid down with me. It was my grandfather." "Then there must be something in what Peter was telling us all last summer about Meadow Nuncle, even if we did not believe him," the grandmother said. "Who would have thought that such a thing was possible? I didn't imagine the child would live up there 3 weeks. How does she look, Brigida?" In the meantime, Brigida had been looking at her from every side, so she could pretty well tell what she looked like. "She's daintily formed as Adelheid was," she replied, "but she has black eyes and curly hair, like Tobias and the old man up there. I think she resembles both of them." Meanwhile, Heidi had not been idle. She had peered about her and examined closely everything that was to be seen. Now she said, "Look, Grandmother, there's a window blind that keeps swinging out and back. Grandfather ought to drive a nail in it right away to fasten it. If he doesn't, it will break the pane. Just see how it's acting." "You nice child, you," the grandmother said.
I can't see the blind, but I can hear it fast enough, and many other things too. It isn't only the shutter, but everything creaks and pounds when the wind blows, and it gets in every place. Nothing's tight any more, and often at night when the other two are asleep, I get so terribly afraid that the whole house is coming down on our heads and will kill the three of us. Alas, there's no one who can mend things in the cottage, for Peter doesn't know how."
"But why can't you see what the blind is doing, Grandmother? Look, there it goes again, right over there." Heidi pointed her finger straight at the spot.
"Ah, child, I can't see the least little thing, the blind or anything else," the grandmother said sadly.
"But suppose I run out and open the blind wide, so that it is very light. Then you can see, can't you?"
"No, no, not even then. No one can ever make it light for me again."
"But if you go out where the snow is all white, then it will surely be bright enough. You just come with me, Grandmother, and I'll prove it." Heidi took the old lady's hand and tried to lead her away, for she was beginning to worry, because it did not seem light anywhere to her friend.
"Just let me sit quietly, you dear child. Things are dark to me all the same, even in the snow and the light. They do not reach my eyes any more."
"But it's different in the summertime, Grandmother," said Heidi, still trying to find some way out of the trouble. "You know, when the sun shines down as hot as anything and starts to say good night, and the mountains glow as red as fire and all the yellow flowers are gleaming, why, then it will be light again for you, won't it?"
"My child, I shall never see them again, the fiery mountains and the golden flowers up there. Never, never again will the earth be bright for me. Never again."
At these words, Heidi burst into tears. Full of sorrow, she kept sobbing aloud. "Who can make things bright for you again, then? Can't somebody do it? Can't anyone?" And then the old lady tried to comfort the child, but that was not easy to do. Heidi almost never cried, but when she once started, then it was almost impossible to make her forget her trouble. The grandmother had soon tried every means of quieting the child, because she could not bear to hear her sob so pitifully. She said, "Come here, dear Heidi, come to me. I've got something to tell you. You know, when a person can't see things, it's such good fun to hear kind words. And I dearly love to hear you talk. Sit down close to me and tell me what you do at your house, and what grandfather does. I used to know him well long ago, but I've heard nothing about him for many years, except what Peter tells me, and he doesn't say much." That is when the new idea came to Heidi. She wiped her tears away and quickly said comfortingly, "You just wait, Grandmother. I'm going to tell Grandfather everything. He'll soon make it light for you again, and he'll mend the cottage so it won't fall down. He can put things in fine shape." The old lady said nothing, and then Heidi began to tell her excitedly of her life with Grandfather, of the days in the pasture, and all about her present winter life. She told her what Grandfather could make out of wood, benches and chairs and fine mangers, from which Schweinli and Berli could eat their hay, and a big new water trough to bathe in summers, and a new milk bowl and spoon. Heidi grew more and more eager in describing the pretty things, which could be made in a jiffy out of a piece of wood. She said she always stood right by Grandfather and watched him closely, for some time she was going to do all those things herself. The grandmother listened with great interest, and from time to time she would interrupt to ask, "Do you hear all this, Brigida? Do you hear what she's saying about Nuncle?" Suddenly the tale was broken off by a great clatter at the door, and Peter came stamping in. But he stopped at once, and opened his round eyes wide in surprise when he saw Heidi, and he made the happiest face you can imagine, as she cried out quickly, "Good afternoon, Peter." "My, is it possible he's out of school so soon?" the grandmother called in great astonishment. "No afternoon has gone so quickly for many a year. Good afternoon, dear Peter. How goes the reading?" "Just like always. Peter answered. "Oh, oh," said the grandmother with a gentle sigh.
"I had hoped there'd be a change by the time you were almost 12 years old. And your birthday's in February."
"Why must there be a change, grandmother?" Heidi asked with sudden interest.
"I just hoped that he might be able to learn more in his reading," said grandmother. "I have an old prayer book on the shelf, and there are such pretty hymns in it. I haven't heard them for such a long time, and I cannot remember them any more. I had hoped Peter would learn, so he could read a hymn to me sometimes. But he can't learn, it's too hard for him."
"I believe I must make a light. It's already growing quite dark now," said Peter's mother, who all this time had been busily patching his jacket. "The afternoon has slipped away from me, too, before I noticed it." Then Heidi sprang up from her little chair, put out her hand hastily, and said, "Good night, grandmother. I must go home right away, now that it's growing dark." She offered her hand in turn to Peter and his mother, and walked to the door.
Wait, you can't go alone that way. Peter will have to go with you, do you hear? And be careful, Peter dear, that the child doesn't stumble. And don't stand still, so she'll freeze, remember? And has she got a good thick muffler around her neck?"
"I haven't any old muffler," Heidi called back, "but I shan't freeze." Thereupon she flashed out of the door and scurried away so fast that Peter could scarcely catch up with her. But the grandmother cried out urgently, "Run right after her, Brigida, run quickly! The child is sure to freeze out there in the night that way. Hurry, won't you?" Brigida did as she was told, but the children had gone only a few steps up the mountain when they saw grandfather coming down to meet them. He reached them in a few long strides.
"That's nice, Heidi, you've kept your promise," he said.
He bundled up the child again tightly in her covering, raised her in his arms, and set off up the mountain. Brigida had been just in time to see the old man wrap the child up well, lift her into his arms, and set out on his homeward journey. She went back into the cottage with Peter and told the grandmother with amazement what she had seen. The old lady was also very much surprised and kept repeating, "God be praised and thanked that he feels that way toward the child. Praise God indeed. If he will only let her come to me again. The child did me so much good. What a kind heart she has." And until she went to bed that night, she kept saying, "If she will only come again. For now, when I least expected it, there is still something left in this world to give me joy." And each time Brigida would agree with her, while Peter would nod his head and grin widely with pleasure and say, "I told you so." In the meantime, Heidi, inside of her sack, kept up a constant chatter, but as her voice could not be heard through the 8 folds of her covering, and grandfather therefore did not understand a word she said, he called to her, "Wait a little while until we're home, then you can tell me." As soon then as he had reached the hut on top, and had peeled off Heidi's wraps, she began, "Grandfather, tomorrow we'll have to take the hammer and some big nails along with us and fasten the shutter in grandmother's house. We'll have to drive a lot more nails, too, for everything creaks and rattles at her place."
"Have to, eh? We must do that, must we? Who said so?" grandfather asked.
"Nobody said so. I just know it, that's all," Heidi replied, "because everything is loose. And it makes grandmother terribly anxious when things rattle, so she can't sleep. And she thinks now everything's going to tumble down on our heads. And you can't make things light for grandmother any more, at least she doesn't see how anyone can, but you can do it, grandfather, I'm sure. Just think how sad it is for her to be always in the dark, and she gets so scared, and no one but you can help her. Tomorrow we'll go and help her, won't we, grandfather?" Heidi had clung fast to her grandfather, and was looking up at him in perfect trust. The old man gazed down at the child a while, and then said, "Yes, Heidi, we'll fix things up so that nothing more rattles in grandmother's house, and we'll do it tomorrow." The child started to jump for joy all around the big room, and to cry out one time after another, "We're going to do it tomorrow, tomorrow." And her grandfather kept his promise. The next afternoon they took the same ride on the sled, Just as on the previous day, the old man set the child down before Goat Peter's door and said, "Now go in, and when it gets to be night, come back." Then he laid the sack on the sled and went around the house. Heidi had scarcely opened the door and jumped into the room when from the corner Grandmother called out happily, "There comes the child! There's the blessed child!" In her great joy, she dropped the thread and stopped the wheel and stretched out both hands to the girl. Heidi ran to her, dragged at once the low stool quite near to her, sat down on it, and again had a whole lot of things to tell Grandmother and to ask of her. But just then there started such an awful pounding on the house that Grandmother was terribly frightened. She almost knocked over the spinning wheel, she trembled so. She cried out, "Oh, dearie me, it's come at last. It's all falling to pieces." But Heidi took her firmly by the arm and said comfortingly, "No, no, Grandmother, don't be afraid. It's only Grandfather with his hammer. He's mending things, so you won't worry any longer." "Oh, you don't mean it! Is it possible? Then the dear God has not quite forgotten us," Grandmother exclaimed. "Did you hear what that is, Brigida? Did you hear? It's a hammer, as sure as you live. Go and see, Brigida, and if it's the Meadow Nuncle, tell him he must come in a minute and let me thank him." Brigida went out. Meadow Nuncle was at that moment driving new logs into the wall with great force. Brigida went up to him and said, "A good afternoon, Nuncle, from Mother and me. We're grateful to you for your work, and Mother is eager to thank you for herself indoors. No one else would be so kind to us, and we want to thank you for surely—" "Cut it short," the old gentleman interrupted her. "I know exactly what you think of the Meadow Nuncle. You just go back again. I can find what needs doing without help." Brigida obeyed at once, for Nuncle had a way with him that was not easy to resist. He pounded and hammered all around the cottage. Then he mounted the narrow ladder that led up to the roof and kept up his hammering until he had used up the very last nail he had brought with him. In the meantime, it had begun to be dark again, but he had scarcely climbed down and drawn his sled out from behind the goat shed when Heidi came out of the door. He wrapped her up as he had done the day before and took her in his arms, drawing the empty sled behind him. For if she had sat on it all alone, her coverings might have fallen off, and Heidi would have nearly frozen, perhaps quite so. Grandfather well knew that, and kept the child warm in his arms. Thus the long winter passed away. Joy had come after the long years into the dreary life of the old blind lady, and her days were no more long and dark, each one like the day before it, for she had now something always to look forward to. The very first thing in the morning, she was listening for the tripping footstep, and when the door finally did open, and the child came really dancing in, then she never failed to cry out joyfully, "Heaven be praised! There she comes again!" Then Heidi would sit down close to her and chatter away so happily about everything that she knew that Grandmother was always pleased. The hours flew by so fast she did not notice them, and not one single time did she ask, as she used to, "Brigida, isn't the day over yet?" But each time that Heidi had closed the door after her, Grandmother would say, "Why, how short the afternoon has been, Brigida!" And the daughter would answer, "It has, hasn't it? Seems as if we had hardly put the dinner plates away." And then Grandmother would say after that, "If the good Lord will only keep the child safe for me, and will keep Meadow Nuncle in a good humor. Does she look healthy, Brigida?" Each time the daughter would answer, "She looks like a strawberry apple." And Heidi, for her part, had a great affection for the old grandmother. Whenever she remembered that no one, not even her grandfather, could make things bright for her again, a great sadness always swept over her. But Grandmother would always tell Heidi that she suffered least when the child was with her, and so Heidi went down on her sled to see her every fine winter day. Grandfather continued to take her without saying a word against it. Each time he took his hammer and all sorts of things along, and many a long afternoon he pounded away at the cottage of Goat Peter. This work had one good effect, too. There was no more creaking and rattling through the night. Grandmother said that she had not been able to sleep for many a long winter, and she would never forget to be grateful to Nuncle for his help. This is your host, Catherine Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to Heidi. I'd love to hear your suggestions for future stories, so please send an email to me at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.